Donald Trump has scored a major political victory. We still don't know whether there will be peace in Ukraine or what that peace will actually look like, but Donald Trump has already secured a big win. European leaders said they would travel to Washington to show their support for Zelensky and avoid another clash. But what they really did was a complete U-turn on the positions they had defended for years. Reaching peace quickly was always possible. All it took was giving the tyrant, or perhaps now in European terminology, the respected president of Russia, what he wanted. And that's exactly what now seems to be happening. No ceasefire, no NATO membership for Ukraine, no military victory, no recovery of lost territory, no prosecution of war crimes, no sanctions. This was Trump's plan from the very beginning, and now it seems to be Europe's plan too. The good news is that the war could end soon. Let's hope, at least, that this is the case. The bad news is that, apparently, the old continent will be left footing a mounting of bills, all for the benefit of the United States. We'll look at this in more detail. VisualPolitik community, this is not just another video about the war in Ukraine. Pay very close attention to what we're about to tell you. Let's get started.
I think if everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat, and I think there will be a reasonable chance of ending the war when we do that.
Just a few hours ago, Donald Trump opened the second of the most anticipated meetings in recent months, right after last Friday's meeting he held with Putin in Alaska. The war in Ukraine, a war that has now dragged on for nearly 4 years, leaving behind a brutal trail of deaths, destroyed cities, and a trembling Europe, which may be closer than ever to ending, though not in a way that many of us would have hoped. What we are witnessing is an opera in 2 acts. The first act took place a few days ago, during the meeting between Trump and Putin, behind closed doors, with no Zelensky in the room. A meeting that literally began with Trump rolling out the red carpet for the Russian dictator, even applauding him as he stepped off the plane. If that meeting served any purpose, it was to bring Vladimir Putin back into the international political arena as a legitimate, valid interlocutor once again. Right there, in the United States, surrounded by flags and presidential seals. A full-blown state welcome with all the pomp and grandeur imaginable, while Vladimir continued bombing Ukraine. He didn't even bother to halt the attacks during the visit. He didn't need to. He got a huge lifeline. Suddenly, Putin presented himself as a man of peace, ready for dialogue, concerned about the victims, and deeply rooted in religious convictions. Basically, it was like a PR ad, a massive gift courtesy of Donald Trump. That was Act 1. Act 2 happened just yesterday. This past Monday, we all witnessed Zelensky's arrival at the White House, accompanied by a whole entourage of European presidents and prime ministers. Among them, of course, Lady Defeat herself. You know who I mean, Ursula von der Leyen, and the aspiring presidential butler, Mark Rutte. And the question is, what exactly did they go to Washington for? Well, my friends, there are 2 possible interpretations. The easy one. They went to support Zelensky, to have that photo of historic unity, to promote peace, to reinforce the Atlantic bond, blah blah blah, and also to prevent Trump from presenting his deal with Putin as a done deal. And then there's the other interpretation, much harsher, but perhaps much closer to reality. European leaders traveled to Washington to bend the knee and say, Trump, you were right. We never should have gotten ourselves into this Ukraine mess. It would have been so much easier to just give Putin what he wanted 3 years ago. Think of all the headaches we could have avoided. No moral hazard, no human rights, no justice, nothing at all. What we saw yesterday was the clear staging of Europe now being 100% on the same page as Donald Trump. They want to end the war now, as quickly as possible, whatever the cost, without considering either Ukraine's integrity or the dangerous precedents set when a bully gets away with everything through brute force. Hold on, do you think we're exaggerating? Well, maybe that's because you haven't yet heard the words of NATO's Mark Rutte and Finland's President Alexander Stubb, where they made it crystal clear. Take a look.
We want to thank you, President of the United States, dear Donald, for the fact that you, as I said before, broke the deadlock with President Putin by starting that dialogue. And I think it was in February that you had the first phone call, and from there we are now where we are today. And that is, I think, if we play this well, we could end this. And we have to end this. We have to stop the killing, we have to stop the destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure. It is a terrible war.
I think in the past 2 weeks we've probably had more progress in ending this war than we have in the past 3.5 years. And I think the fact that we're around this table today is very much symbolic in the sense that it's Team Europe and Team United States helping Ukraine.
At first glance, these might sound like reasonable words. Of course, we all want this war to end as soon as possible. The problem lies in what's being hidden, in what's not being said. What exactly is supposed to be done now to make the war end quickly, and what the implications of that could be for the future. And my friends, this is the key to everything we're going to explain in this video, because with what we know so far, the agenda is clear. The idea, it seems, is to give Putin his territorial victory, allowing him to annex at least a fifth of Ukraine so that he can tell the Russian people, see, I was right, we are making Russia great again. They also want to give Putin the guarantee that Ukraine will not join NATO, that war crimes will not be prosecuted, and that sanctions will gradually fade away. They even want to hand him the win in the political and historical narrative. You know the story. Ultimately, the blame lies with Biden and Zelensky. Zelensky, a man who refuses to hold elections, while Putin supposedly is the one who wants peace. And let's be clear, this is something Trump himself repeated again just yesterday. And all of this in exchange for what? In exchange for Putin stopping the bombing. Which sounds fine, until you realize that we're basically talking about almost all the goals Putin had in mind when he launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The same concessions he himself proposed back in the summer of 2022 to end the war. In other words, the good news is that the war may end soon. The bad news is that Putin and everything he represents will walk away with a huge victory. And to be fair, we here at VisualPolitik have said before that we were convinced the most likely outcome would be a Korean-style scenario, a ceasefire that freezes the front. Well, this is something like that, but with many more bells and whistles and much more venom. Because let's not kid ourselves, this is not a negotiated settlement that works in Ukraine's favor. This is a plan to turn the page as quickly as possible, and that's why the burden falls squarely on Ukraine. In fact, even before the meeting began, Trump had already dropped some hints about where all of this was heading.
President Zelensky of Ukraine can end the war with Russia almost immediately if he wants to, or he can continue to fight. Remember how it started. No getting back Obama given Crimea 12 years ago without a shot being fired, and no going into NATO by Ukraine. Some things never change.
Alright, let's get straight to the point. What's on the table is not just a handful of cards and chips, but rather the beginning of an agreement that leaves Ukraine stripped down to its underwear. If Ukraine wants peace, it has to say goodbye once and for all to Crimea, to Donbass, to its dream of joining NATO, to its full sovereignty as a country, and to prosecuting the war crimes it has suffered. And that's just the bare minimum. On top of that, Trump has made it clear that he doesn't even want to hear about a provisional ceasefire. His idea is to go straight for a peace deal because, according to him, ceasefires often don't hold, which, by the way, is the exact opposite of what Trump himself was saying before meeting Putin. Up until then, he was fixated on achieving a ceasefire. But in that meeting in Alaska, well, you know, he changed his mind. And you may be wondering, what else has Trump agreed with Putin about this so-called territorial exchange? Are there any security guarantees for Ukraine? What could this deal really mean for Ukraine? The story we're about to tell you is something many will call the path to peace, and others will see as a forced surrender. And here, we need to lay all the cards on the table. Trump wants to be remembered as the guy who ended the war, even if that means doing something as simple as handing victory to the aggressor. Putin wants to legitimize his conquests. The Europeans want to move on, and Zelensky is trying to make sure this betrayal hurts Ukraine as little as possible. Pay close attention, because here, no one does anything without a reason, including the fact that this time the Ukrainian president showed up wearing a jacket and shirt. I suppose he told himself something like, look, Volodymyr, this is no time for casual wear, put on a suit, say thank you 40 times, accept whatever dish they serve you, and then say thank you again.
Although there are also those who argue that what Zelensky is really doing is playing along with Trump to buy time, knowing full well that Putin will throw up obstacles, refuse to meet with him beforehand, and that reaching an agreement won't be so simple. Only time will tell if that's the case or not.
Anyway, let's get into all the details. Peace
or capitulation?
One thing is for sure, you can't say Trump has misled anyone. What's coming out of the latest meetings, and what the Europeans are now accepting, is exactly what Trump has been advocating for years. So the question is, what exactly is the plan they're working on? Well, let's start with the basics. How Ukraine would look territorially. There's still no signed agreement that defines the exact new borders that would officially end the war. But by now, everyone takes for granted that Ukraine's territorial loss is inevitable. And not only inevitable, on the ground, it looks like the war will end with a Russian victory. And yes, to be fair, it's not exactly what Moscow had in mind when they launched the invasion. At that time, they wanted control over the entire country. But the truth is that the territorial deal looks very similar to one that could probably have been signed 3 years ago, back in the summer of 2022. Except that at that time, neither Zelensky nor European governments wanted to even consider that possibility, and with good reason. Because here, Trump is probably being a bit naive, to put it mildly. Do you remember that Truth Social post from the US president we saw a moment ago? The one where he spoke about giving up Crimea and ruling out NATO membership? Well, that could be a sign that Trump and his negotiators think they might be able to sweet-talk Putin if they can convince Zelensky to hand over the entire Donbass and officially recognize Crimea as Russian, that this might be enough for peace. Well, enough. Plus, keeping the conquered territory in the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, which would apparently be split along the front line that exists when the fighting stops. The problem, my friends, is that Putin didn't launch this war just to end up with that. Because, oh, surprise, these were territories that Russia already controlled. For the most part, Crimea was already under Russian control, and in Donbass, Moscow already controlled the main cities and much of the territory. So if he wasn't satisfied with that before, why would he be now? That's actually one of the reasons why this option was never seriously considered until now. Recognizing annexation by force sets a very troubling precedent. If it worked once, why wouldn't he try again in some form until achieving the ultimate goal, controlling the entire country? Even more so if Ukraine is forced to withdraw from its own territory, not currently occupied, just to gift it to Moscow as a reward for invading, which is exactly what's now on the table. I insist, this sets a very bad precedent. In any case, in exchange, Russia might hand back some small occupied territories in Kharkiv and Sumy, as well as the Zaporizhia power plant, though that last point remains uncertain. This is how Ukraine's room for negotiation has been abruptly reduced, and the result, Putin would fulfill the promise he made to the Russian people when he launched the invasion. Quote unquote, liberate the Donbass, protect the supposedly oppressed Russian speakers from what he calls the Nazi regime in Kyiv, and make Russia greater, not to mention that this area holds major economic value, because right here lie most of the coal deposits, minerals, and even rare earth elements that could have been key to reviving Ukraine's economy and industry. Clearly, that's no longer the case. And it's not just about money, resources, or land for the sake of land. The area Russia controls, and is absolutely unwilling to give up, almost perfectly overlaps with the historic region of Novorossiya, a historical region that Putin has repeatedly invoked to argue that modern Ukraine is a historical mistake, that it makes no sense and has no legitimacy as an independent country. In other words, yet another win. Thanks to Washington's new position, but above all, thanks to the Europeans' new stance. The very same Europeans who spent months and years saying they would never consider ceding territory or negotiating while the attacks continued, only to now, after hundreds of thousands of lives lost and hundreds of billions spent, do exactly the opposite. We'll see how Ukraine and Ukrainian society emerge from all this. What was all the suffering for? What was all the resistance for? But there's another problem. Ukraine's constitution explicitly forbids ceding or dividing national territory. That has been the case since 1996, and it was reinforced in 2014. In other words, to appease Putin, Ukraine would even have to tamper with its own constitution, all in the name of peace. A peace whose duration and consequences remain to be seen. In any case, this brings us directly to another crucial issue, these so-called security guarantees, and you'd better pay close attention to this. If there's one thing Zelensky has begged for again and again over the past months, it's that Ukraine needs security guarantees for the post-war period. Guarantees that if Ukraine signs a peace deal, Russia won't just wake up one day, get bored, and decide to repeat the whole thing. In other words, guarantees that the West won't back down when things get tough and heavy artillery needs to be brought out. And the problem is that, in practice, there's only one way such guarantees could actually exist, and that's with Ukraine joining NATO. Something that, as we've already explained, the plan completely rules rolls out. However, wait a second, because in the past few hours, they've suddenly pulled a rabbit out of the hat.
We got to an agreement that the US and other nations could effectively offer Article 5-like language to Ukraine.
Yeah, you've heard that right. Supposedly, Ukraine would receive a kind of protection similar to NATO's Article 5, that is, mutual defense under the principle of an attack on one is an attack on all, but without actually being part of the alliance. And not only that, now the Russians are even saying they might agree to it.
Many leaders of EU states emphasize that a future peace agreement should provide reliable security assurances or guarantees for Ukraine. Russia agrees with that, but it has equal right to expect that Moscow will also get efficient security guarantees.
And Russia agrees to that? Seriously? Well, there has to be a catch. And in fact, there is. Nobody actually believes it. Before the invasion of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the country was, in a way, already protected by a guarantee, the Budapest Memorandum, an agreement signed in 1994 that supposedly guaranteed Ukraine's security in exchange for the country giving up its nuclear weapons. In fact, it literally stated this.
The Russian Federation, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America reaffirmed their commitment to Ukraine to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine.
Russia not only committed to respecting Ukraine's borders, which they themselves had recognized, but also to refraining from economic coercion and from attacking the country. And we've all seen what happened. Moscow has done every single one of those things, and has been doing them for more than a decade. But that's not all. What's being said now is that the security guarantee would come from European countries, not from the United States. And let's be honest, if today there's a war going on and their commitment has been minimal, does anyone really believe that? If in the future there were a border incident or a false flag operation, Europeans would come rushing to Kyiv's aid? Not a chance. That's precisely why the Europeans themselves are pointing in another direction. They claim that the real security guarantee will come from a trade deal. Take a look.
Ukraine will promise to buy $100 billion of American weapons financed by Europe in a bid to obtain U.S. guarantees for its security after a peace settlement with Russia.
Wow! So, Trump snubs the Europeans. Europe accepts being snubbed and even slapped with a smile, and on top of that, it's going to cost them $100 billion so that Ukraine buys weapons from the United States, all to compensate for a fake guarantee. What a deal! You know, make America great again. Oh, and something important. Up to now, we haven't even talked about the repercussions this deal can have beyond Ukraine. And they're huge. Because this plan sets a terrible precedent. It basically hands every wannabe dictator with imperial ambitions a clear instruction manual. If you want to invade another country, go ahead and hold on. In the end, you'll get your way. It's also a warning for many democracies. Don't fight back against the bad guys, because the ones who are supposedly the good guys won't actually protect you. And yes, I'm even thinking about countries like Taiwan, South Korea, or Japan. My friends, it is good news that the war may soon be over. There's no doubt about that. But if Europeans and the Ukrainian government were really willing to accept this outcome, then the war should have ended a long time ago. As for the moral hazard this creates and the historic loss of Western values, well, I think that's something we're going to be talking about a lot here at VisualPolitik, because that so-called rules-based world is about to expire. So, good luck to Ukraine, and good luck to all Europeans with the bills you'll have to pay, though maybe Russian gas will help with that.
Although it still remains to be seen whether Vladimir Putin will actually accept the deal. He knows he now has more negotiating power than ever, basically because the rest of the world has already sold peace, and he has scored a more than considerable political victory.
But for now, it's your turn. What do you think about a possible peace where Russia gets everything it's been demanding for the past 3 years? Do you think that could happen in the future if Trump's, and now Europe's plan, moves forward? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and let's open up the debate. I'm sure it's going to be very interesting. But before you go, very important, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already. It's free and it helps us out a lot. Thank you so much. See you in the next one.